One of the most powerful and useful features in Java is the so-called if statement, which is the basic way we have in most programming languages to make decisions. So a decision can be looking at data and choosing to do something based on what that data looks like. So let me try writing a little program here to check if a class is full. So let me start by creating two variables. So I'm going to create a variable to store the enrollment cap. So let's say it's CST 200 when we have 250 spaces. So we'll start with a variable called cap and we'll set it equal to 250, representing the capacity of a class. And we'll also have another variable called enrolled. And enrolled will be the actual number of people, which I think is 168 or something. So let's try using an if statement. Well, what I want to do is I want to use my if statement to compare these and then print a message if the class is full. So let's write if, right, the word if, an open parenthesis, then my condition that I want to check, which is going to be enrolled equal cap, right, meaning is the number of people enrolled equal to the actual cap for that class. And that's enough for me to actually check to see whether the class is full or not. Then inside, I'll start typing some more code, and this will be the bit of code that gets executed if that statement, right, if that Boolean expression turns out to be true. So let's write in here, the class is full. So this is my very simple program that just checks to see whether a class is full. And if I compile this and run it, you'll notice that I don't actually get any output, right? Because at this point in time, if I look at these variables, I notice that I have 168 people enrolled. That's not quite at the cap. So let's change that up a bit. Let's write 250 here. Compile this, run this. Now I get back the message telling me the class is full. So the whole idea of an if statement is that it checks to see if some condition is true, right? It checks to see whether this part here is true, right? Is enrolled equal to cap. Well, if it is, then do this, right? Print this message out here. That's the whole idea of an if statement. It's giving you a condition and then letting you do something. And I could also have different conditions here, right? I could also have something, for example, let's say enrolled is greater than 175. I could have a different message then. The class is getting full. Let's compile this, run it, and then we'll get the message the class is getting full, right? Because in this case, my enrolled 250 is bigger than 175, and so then this message is printed. If it's smaller, right, and this is what we kind of showed before, say it's 100, then that message isn't shown, right? No new text appeared down here when I changed enrolled to 100 and then I ran this. Nothing else appeared because that expression here, right, that ended up being false, and if that's false, this doesn't need to run, right? So the program just continues on. And maybe we can even show that a little bit better. Let's add a print at the end of this thing. So we'll just have a little message here to tell us that we're done. So I can compile this and run it. And you'll see that that message inside, right, that thing didn't show, but the done did show, right? Because that bit of code was executed after that if ran, right? The if checked that conditional, found out that it was false, so it skipped the stuff inside of it. And then it moved down to this line over here, right? Our last line of our program. So it just continued on, right? And then it printed out the word done there. So let's say we wanted to do a little bit more. Maybe instead of just showing a message when enrolled is over that number, we want to show a message when that enrolled is not greater than that number. Well, the way we can do that is by adding an else statement. So after an if, right, you have to already have an if. You already have to have one of those in your program. What we can do is we can write the word else. And what that does is it gives us a line of code that will execute if the first if, right, if this part here ended up being false, right? If this was false, then this doesn't get executed. But if it turns out that that was false, right, nothing happened, then what it'll do is it'll jump down here to this else, and it'll do what's ever in that on that line. So we'll put over here, right, the class is not getting full. So now if I run this, I will actually get a message. Here I get the message, the class is not getting full, right? Remember that enroll was set to 100. Then over here, right, when this was running, it compared it as 100 greater than 175. Well, it wasn't, so it skipped this message here. But then it continued on, right? It went to this else branch, right? The bit of code that gets executed if that original condition was not true. So it goes over here, and then it executes this line here, which prints the message the class is not getting full. So this is kind of like the opposite, right? This is what we print if it's false. This is what we print if it's true. And this is a pretty nice feature, right? Because we didn't need to write any condition again. We had to write a condition for original if, right? We had to type out this whole thing here, right? Enrolled greater than 175. But over on the else, we didn't actually type anything there. We just put the word else. And then Java knew that, oh, if the first part of the if failed, right, if that computed to false, then go ahead and jump down and do whatever else there is to do. It doesn't need to do any more logic. It just knows that, oh, the first thing was false, so let me do this instead. Now let's suppose we wanted to expand our program a little bit. Maybe in that else branch, right, the thing that happens if the condition is false, we want to print a second message. For example, we want to print, let's see, a message saying that the class can be made smaller. So let's go ahead and add in our line of code. So right now, if I run this program, I would expect that it's going to print these two things. It's going to print the class is not getting full, and then the class can be made smaller, right? Because enrolled right now is 100. 100 is not greater than 175, so it goes over to the else branch. So let's run this, see what we get. Well, we got what we expected. We got those two different messages. Unfortunately, this thing isn't quite done. So let's try changing enrolled to 200 and see what happens there. In this case, notice that first message changes, right? So now it's using the true branch of that if statement. So it says the class is getting full, which is what we wanted. But then after that, it says the class can be made smaller. That's not what we wanted though, right? We only want that message to appear if that if goes through the else branch, right? If that ends up being false up here, right, then we want to jump down here and do these two things. Unfortunately, there's an issue right now. Java only looks at the first line, right, the first statement after the else or after the if, and that's what it works with, right? That's what it acts on. So maybe the way we could have written this program, either maybe would make its function more clear, is to write it like this, right? So in this case, we can clearly see that we have an if statement with a true branch and a false branch, and then after that, we have a separate print statement that has the class can be made smaller. Now, what we really want is we want that third message there to be part of the else branch. The way we do that is by making a block of code. So the way I'll do that is I'll put a curly bracer up here and a curly bracer down here. And I'll need to indent my code a little bit so it looks nice. This is the way we indicate to Java that these two lines go together, that there's this single block of code, right? Could be all sorts of things in here, but this single block of code is associated with the else branch and the if. If the else branch needs to be used, do everything in here, so instead of just doing the one line after it. So now let's compile it, run it, and see what we get. In this case, we get what we hoped for, right? So enroll was set to 200, therefore this ends up being true, and this message is printed. And unlike last time, that message about the class being made smaller, that isn't being displayed. So in this case, right, this print statement now only exists in the else branch because we put it inside of a code block. And you'll need to do this whenever you have more than one line in your if statement or your else statement. You'll always need to have your curlies there if you have more than one line. And if you have one line, you can still add them anyways. It's not going to change anything. So we could have rewritten the first one like this. And that's fine too. Some people even rewrite their code to look like this and put kind of the curlies in the same line. Right now, we didn't really need to tinker with the first part, right? We didn't need to tinker with the classes getting full. Since we had only one line there, it worked as we expected. But if I want to have multiple lines there, then I would need to make it a code block, right? By putting in these curly braces around it. There is also another way to write the if statement that's a little bit shorter, and it's something we call the conditional operator. So I'm going to code in a little bit more stuff here in order to get a decent example. So let's say we have another variable called TAs, right? How many TAs a class gets. And we'll say initially this variable is just set to 0. And then what I might think of doing if I just had an if statement is doing an if here to check to see how many TAs a class gets assigned. So let's say if enrolled greater than 42, then TAs equal 1. Else, and we'll go and actually put TAs equals 0 again. Probably don't need this here. So we have a variable called TAs. Based on how many people are enrolled, it'll either be 1 or 0. That's one way of setting that value of TAs. but there's actually a different way to do it as well. And let's actually throw in a print statement right here that will display that value that we're computing there. So we'll do this really quick. So that'll print for me the value that gets stored in the TA's variable. So let me run this, and hopefully get back to number 1. TA is 1. That's actually printing after the word done, but that's fine. There's actually a shorter way to write this, which is using the conditional operator that I mentioned a moment ago. So instead of writing this whole thing here, what I can do is I can write TAs equal enrolled greater than 42, question mark, 1, colon, 0. And that is actually going to be the equivalent of that entire if statement I had up there. So let's run this and verify that it works again. And I get the same thing here, right? TA is 1. So this is a short form if. You can try comparing these and see where kind of the logic lies. So notice in the if statement we had written originally, we had written enrolled greater than 42 over here. And then below we wrote enrolled greater than 42 again right here. So this is where the condition is, right? It's going to be to the left of this question mark symbol. And then over here, if we look at the short form again, to the next thing that's on the right of that question mark is the number 1, which actually corresponds to the TA is equal 1. It actually corresponds exactly to the equal 1 part. Over here, right, then we have a colon to show that now we need to look at the else part of this if statement. And then there, right, we have a 0, which corresponds with the equal 0 over here. So as a whole, what this line is saying is check to see whether enrolled is greater than 42. And if it is, this whole thing will evaluate to 1. If it's not, then it'll evaluate to 0. So after this has been run, there will be effectively a 1 or a 0 written here. And then that 1 or a 0, that'll be saved into the TA's variable. And then its result is going to be displayed down here. So this is a short form if. You'll see these occasionally. I personally am not a big fan of them. I think that they make your code a little bit hard to understand sometimes. But they can let you write a code that's a little bit more concise. So let's back up and go back to our original code fragment. There's one more thing we need to see. So over here, I just have a single if statement. One thing that Java lets me do is nest them. So I can put an if statement inside of an if statement. So for example, I can go over here and write another if statement right inside of the true branch for this first one, and check to see, for example, if it's getting very, very close. So let's say if enrolled is over 245. In that case, I can print a different message or an additional message. I can write the class is getting very full. So this is now an if statement inside of another if statement. So let's imagine this program running. Enrolled is set to 200. First, Java looks at this first line. Is 200 greater than 175? Well, it is, so this if statement is true. So it's going to look into this true branch, right? The stuff that's up here. First thing it'll do is print this message. The class is getting full. But then it's going to run a second if statement, right? So because this first one is true and it went inside, this second if statement now has the opportunity to run or to be checked. So in that case, it'll check is 200 greater than 245. That ends up being false, so this line inside of that second if statement isn't going to run, right? So it's not going to print that. So let's start running this, and hopefully we get the message the class is getting full. So that's what we get. The class is getting full, which is what we were wanting to get. Let me try changing enroll to be 249. Let's compile this and run it. And this time you'll see that we get two messages. We get first the class is getting full, and then the class is very full, followed by our done. So it's showing this message here, right, which was after the first if statement, and then this message here, which is inside of the second if statement. Because this first one was true, right, it had the opportunity to look and run the second if statement and see if it was true, and if it was, then it printed this message. And this can be done as many times as you want, right? You can put as many if statements inside of another if statement as you want, and that lets you have more complex logic. Another thing you could do is maybe think back to our discussion of Boolean expressions, and you can imagine that you can also have a more complicated rule over here, right? It doesn't have to just be greater than, right? It can also be less than or something, right? So we could also have something along the lines of, enrolled less than 251. So there's all sorts of things you can do in order to get whatever logic you want from your program.